Hello. Thanks for coming in today. It is great to meet you. I have had a chance to look over your portfolio and your resume, and it looks like you have about a year of professional experience now in the animation and VFX space. How are you doing today?
I am doing well, thank you. I am really excited to be here. I have been following the work your studio does for a while, so I am looking forward to talking about how my skills might fit in with the team.
We appreciate that. To start things off, I want to keep it pretty light and just get a feel for your fundamental understanding of the pipeline. Let's talk about modeling and the basics. When you are building a model, we hear the word topology tossed around a lot. For someone at your level, how do you define topology, and why does it actually matter in a production environment?
Right, so topology essentially refers to the arrangement and the flow of the edges, vertices, and faces that make up a 3D mesh. If you think of a model like a piece of clothing, the topology is like the stitching and the way the fabric is cut. It determines how the surface of the model is structured, which is critical because it directly affects how the model deforms during animation and how efficiently the renderer can process it. In a production environment, good topology is the difference between a character that looks natural when they move and one that looks like they are collapsing. You want a smooth distribution of polygons and a flow that follows the natural muscle lines of a character. If the topology is clean, you avoid things like pinching or weird stretching when the model moves, and it just makes the whole process downstream much easier for the riggers and animators.
That makes sense. Speaking of that flow, can you touch on the difference between general polygons and quads? Why is there such a push in the industry to stick to quads specifically?
Sure. So polygons are basically any flat shape with 3 or more straight sides. That could be a triangle, a square, or even a pentagon. Quads specifically are polygons that have exactly 4 sides. The reason we prefer quads in 3D modeling is mostly because of how they deform. When a model is animated, quads tend to bend and stretch much more predictably and smoothly. If you have a lot of triangles or engons, which are polygons with more than 4 sides, you often get these uneven surfaces or visual artifacts, especially when you apply a subdivision surface. Modifier. Quads keep the mesh clean and make the weight painting process a lot more manageable.
You mentioned deformation. Let's dig into that. If you were handed a character model and you noticed the topology was poor, what specific problems would you expect to see once that model actually gets into the animation phase?
If the topology is bad, the first thing you'll notice is unnatural bending. For example, if the edge flow around a joint like an elbow or a knee isn't correct, the mesh might collapse or create a sharp, unrealistic crease instead of a smooth fold. You also run into issues with pinching or bulging. If the polygons are unevenly distributed, you might see a weird bulge in the shoulder when the arm raises or a pinch in the cheek during a facial expression. Then there is the technical side like non-manifold geometry or engons, which can actually cause rendering errors or make the deformations completely unpredictable. It basically makes the rigger's life a nightmare because the weight painting becomes inconsistent, which leads to jittery or stiff animations. You end up spending way more time fixing the mesh in post than if it had just been modeled correctly from the start.
It sounds like you have a good grasp of the relationship between modeling and animation. Let's move into the animation side of things. Let's start with the basics. For the sake of our conversation, can you explain what a keyframe is and why it's the foundation of what we do?
Of course. A keyframe is basically a specific frame in the timeline where you define the starting or ending point of a transition. It is where you set the important pose, position, or rotation of an object. The reason it's so foundational is that the software can then automatically calculate all the frames in between those keyframes through interpolation, which creates that fluid movement. Without keyframes, we would have to manually adjust every single frame of a sequence, which would be incredibly time-consuming and almost impossible to manage for complex scenes. Keyframes allow us to define the core action and then refine the timing and spacing.
Now moving beyond the basics. A lot of junior artists fall into the trap of overanimating to show emotion. How do you approach creating believable character emotion using subtle adjustments rather than those exaggerated, cartoonish movements?
I think the key is observing real-life human behavior. When people feel a strong emotion, it isn't always a big gesture. Often, it is found in the micro-movements. I try to focus on things like slight shifts in weight, tiny changes in the eyes or the set of the mouth, or even very minimal hand gestures. The goal is to make these adjustments feel organic and purposeful. I try to avoid unnecessary motion because too much movement can actually distract the audience from the emotion. It is about restraint. If a character is sad instead of a big sob, maybe it is just a slight slump in the shoulders or a slow blink. By translating those real-world observations into animation, the performance feels authentic and grounded rather than overacted.
I like that approach. Let's shift gears to some technical pipeline questions. When you are preparing assets to be handed off or moved through a pipeline, how are you handling your naming conventions? How do you ensure someone else on the team can actually find and understand what your file is?
Naming conventions are something I've learned are absolutely critical, especially when you are working in a team. If you just name something final V01 fixed, nobody knows what that is. I use a consistent, descriptive, and structured system. Typically, I use a combination of prefixes, suffixes, and separators like underscores. I make sure to include the project name, the asset type, the version number, and the current status of the asset. For example, something like Project HR Hero Model V004WIP. This makes it so anyone can search, sort, and manage the files without having to open every single one to see what's inside. I also think it is important to have these rules documented in a shared space so the whole team is on the same page and we avoid any confusion during handoffs.
That's a very professional way to handle it. Now let's talk about data transfer. In a production pipeline, you'll often encounter Alembic caches. In your experience, when is the right time to use an Alembic cache versus just keeping things as live animation data?
I would use an Alembic cache when I need to transfer complex animated data between different software applications without worrying about losing quality or performance. Since Alembic stores geometry and cameras in a lightweight, efficient format, it can be read by almost any 3D program. This is especially useful when different departments are involved. For example, if I have a character animated in a tool like Maya and I need to send that animation over to a rendering or compositing application, I'll bake it into an Alembic cache. This way, the receiving software doesn't have to calculate the rig or the constraints in real time, it just reads the baked vertex positions. It's much more stable and prevents the animation from shifting slightly between different pieces of software.
While we are on the topic of scene organization, let's talk about null objects. What exactly is a null object, and can you give me a practical example of how you'd use one to simplify a complex animation?
A null object is basically an invisible, non-rendering placeholder. It doesn't show up in the final render, but it acts as a control point or a reference for other objects. I use them all the time as parents or targets for constraints. For a practical example, imagine I have a character holding a flashlight. Instead of animating the flashlight's position and rotation individually, I might parent the flashlight to a null object that is constrained to the character's hand. This allows me to make fine adjustments to the flashlight's position relative to the hand without messing up the overall attachment. They are also great for camera movements. I can parent a camera to a null at the center of a scene and simply rotate the null to create a perfect orbital camera move around an object. It just simplifies the hierarchy and makes the animation much more intuitive.
Let's move into some of the more advanced technical areas. I want to talk about optimization. You're often caught between wanting a scene to look beautiful and wanting it to actually render in a reasonable amount of time. How do decisions regarding polycount and texture resolution affect the artistic integrity and the emotional impact of a scene?
That is a really interesting balance. High polycounts and sharp, high-resolution textures definitely create that sense of realism and depth, which helps immerse the audience and can evoke stronger emotions. If you are doing a close-up of a character's face, you need those details to convey the subtle emotions we talked about earlier. However, if you have excessive detail everywhere, you end up with render times that are just unsustainable. The key is smart optimization. I try to simplify geometry and lower texture resolution in areas that aren't noticeable, like background elements or parts of the environment the camera never focuses on. By preserving the critical details in the areas that carry the most emotional weight, like a character's facial expressions or a key storytelling prop, you maintain the artistic integrity without killing the render farm. If you optimize poorly, the scene can look flat or unpolished, and that can definitely weaken the emotional connection the audience has with the scene.
Following that logic, if you have a scene with hundreds of animated elements, how do you keep that from becoming a technical nightmare? What specific optimization strategies do you use to maintain render efficiency?
For a scene with that much complexity, the first thing I look at is level of detail, or LOD. I'll make sure that objects far away from the camera have significantly fewer polygons and simpler animations. I also rely heavily on instancing. If I have 100 of the same animated crates or pieces of debris, I'll instance them so the renderer only has to process the geometry once, while just varying the transform data for each one. I also try to bake as many animations as possible. If something is a simple loop, baking it avoids real-time calculations during the render. I also organize the scene into hierarchies and layers to control visibility and use occlusion culling to make sure the renderer isn't wasting time on objects that are completely hidden from the camera's view. Finally, I'll optimize the shaders using simpler materials for background objects and reserving the complex, high-res shaders for the hero elements.
Let's talk about something a bit more specialized. If we're looking at a high-end render and we see these beautiful, wavy patterns of light in a swimming pool or through a glass of water, we're talking about caustics. How are those actually simulated, and what is the mathematical approach behind it?
Caustics are those concentrated patterns of light that happen when rays reflect or refract through curved surfaces like water or glass. Because the surface is uneven, the light rays are focused into these bright, dancing patterns. In high-end rendering, we simulate this using either ray tracing or photon mapping. Ray tracing follows the path of individual light rays as they bounce or bend, calculating the exact interaction with the surface to find where they converge. Photon mapping is a bit different. It shoots virtual photons from the light source into the scene, tracks where they hit and scatter, and then stores that data to create the caustic effect. Both methods are computationally expensive because they require so many calculations to get the light paths right, but they are essential if you want water or gemstones to look lifelike.
Let's pivot to materials. Subsurface scattering, or SSS. Why is that so critical for organic materials, specifically skin, and what happens if you leave it out?
Subsurface scattering is that effect where light doesn't just bounce off the surface, but actually penetrates the material, scatters around inside, and then exits at a different point. This creates a soft, diffuse glow. For skin, it is absolutely necessary because human skin isn't opaque. If you look at your hand held up to a bright light, you can see that glow. Without SSS, skin looks flat, waxy, or like plastic. It loses that inner warmth and depth that we instinctively recognize as a living person. Adding SSS is what gives a character that lifelike, organic quality.
I want to move into some simulation questions. Imagine you have a scene where a fluid, like a heavy wave of water, crashes into a brittle material like a glass sculpture. What solvers or methods would you use to make that destruction look accurate?
That's a complex interaction because you have to couple two different types of simulations. For the fluid, I would use a solver like FLIP, which is fluid implicit particle, or perhaps a smoothed particle hydrodynamics approach, depending on the scale. These are great for getting the realistic churning and splashing behavior of liquid. For the glass, which is a brittle material, I would use a fracture solver, likely based on the finite element method, or FEM. This allows the software to calculate the stress on the glass and determine exactly where it should crack and shatter. The real challenge is the two-way interaction. I need the fluid's pressure and momentum to act as the trigger for the fracture solver. Then, as the glass breaks, those shards need to act as collisions that affect the flow of the fluid. It requires very precise collision detection and tight coupling between the two solvers to make sure the glass doesn't just vanish or the water doesn't just pass through it.
That's a high-level answer. Let's talk about a different kind of simulation. If you need natural cloth movements, say, a cape fluttering in the wind, what approach would you recommend? Would you go for a full physics solver or stick with simpler constraints?
I would definitely recommend a physics-based solver combined with constraints. A physics solver is the only way to really get the natural folding, wrinkling, and flowing behavior of cloth because it calculates gravity, wind resistance, and collisions over time. However, you can't just let the physics run wild, or the cloth might stretch like rubber or clip through the character's body. That's where the constraints come in. I'd use constraints to limit how much the fabric can stretch and to ensure it maintains its structural integrity. This balance gives you the most realism while keeping the computation efficient. It's much better than trying to manually animate a cape, which would look stiff and unnatural.
Let's talk about the difference between mesh-based and voxel-based approaches. When would you choose a voxel-based simulation over a traditional mesh deformation?
Mesh-based deformation is all about moving vertices and edges. It's fantastic for things like character animation or cloth because it's computationally efficient and gives you a lot of control over the surface. But it struggles when you need to change the actual topology of the object, like when something is exploding or melting. Voxel-based simulation is completely different because it divides the entire volume of space into a grid of small cubes or voxels. This makes it perfect for volumetric effects like smoke, fire, or fluids, and also for destructible objects where the internal volume matters. If I'm doing a massive explosion or a liquid simulation where I need accurate volumetric behavior, I'm going to use voxels. If I'm animating a character's arm bending, I'm sticking with mesh-based deformation.
Let's move over to the compositing side of the house. One of the biggest tells of a bad VFX shot is when the CG doesn't match the plate. How do you handle mismatching grain or noise patterns between your CG renders and the live-action footage?
That is one of the most important parts of the final polish. The first thing I do is analyze the grain of the live-action plate. I'll often use a denoising tool to isolate the grain or extract a clean plate to see exactly what the noise characteristics are, the size of the grain, its intensity, and how it's distributed. Then, instead of just slapping a noise filter over the whole image, I apply a matching grain pattern specifically to the CG elements. I use grain matching tools to simulate that same size and intensity. I also make sure the grain is applied in the correct color space and at the right stage of the pipeline so it doesn't look like it's sitting on top of the image, but rather that it's part of the same. Sensor data. If the CG is too clean, it stands out immediately, so adding that synthetic grain is what actually glues the CG and the live action together.
In that context, can you explain the role of the alpha channel in your compositing workflow?
The alpha channel is essentially the transparency map of the image. While the RGB channels tell us the color of the pixel, the alpha channel tells us how opaque or transparent that pixel is. A value of 1 or 100% means the pixel is fully opaque, and a value of 0 means it is completely transparent. This is what allows us to layer elements. For example, if I'm adding a CG character into a forest background, the alpha channel allows the compositor to cut out the character perfectly and blend them into the plate without any visible edges. or blocky boxes around them.
Let's talk about lighting. Can you describe a specific scenario where volumetric lighting would be a far superior choice over simple directional lighting?
Directional lighting is great for illuminating surfaces, but it doesn't actually show the light itself. Volumetric lighting is superior whenever you need to create atmosphere or a sense of depth. It simulates how light scatters through particles in the air, like dust, fog, or smoke. A perfect example would be a shot of sunlight streaming through a dense, foggy forest or God rays coming through clouds. In those cases, the beam of light becomes a physical element in the scene. If you just used directional lighting, the ground would be lit, but you wouldn't see the beams of light cutting through the air. Volumetrics add that layer of immersion and mood that makes a scene feel grounded and cinematic.
I want to touch on something a bit more technical. Photogrammetry is becoming huge. When you're dealing with massive datasets from photogrammetry, you often run into fidelity issues. What advanced cleanup or geometric reconstruction methods do you use to get those assets production ready?
Photogrammetry can give you an incredible amount of detail, but the raw data is often very noisy. I start with noise reduction and outlier removal, sometimes using statistical filtering to get rid of those stray points that don't belong to the object. Once the point cloud is clean, I use mesh simplification and decimation. I use things like quadric error metrics to reduce the polycount in flat areas while keeping the high-density detail in the areas with a lot of curvature. For the actual reconstruction, I often use Poisson surface reconstruction to create a smooth, watertight mesh from the point cloud. If there are holes where the cameras didn't get a good angle, I use hole-filling algorithms, sometimes based on radial basis functions, to patch those areas. Finally, I'll do a full pass of texture mapping and UV unwrapping to make sure the surface details are mapped correctly and the overall structure is accurate to the real-world object.
This has been a very thorough dive into your technical process. To wrap things up, imagine you're in a situation where a lead artist gives you a piece of feedback on a shot that you fundamentally disagree with from a technical standpoint. How do you handle that conversation?
I think the best approach is to start with a question to make sure I fully understand their vision. I'd say something like, "I see where you're going with this. Can you help me understand the specific look you're after?" Once I understand the goal, if I still feel there's a technical issue, I would present my concern as a problem-solving exercise rather than a disagreement. I'd say, "I'm worried that if we go this route, we might see some pinching in the mesh or an increase in render time. What if we tried this alternative approach to get the same visual result but keep the pipeline stable?" At the end of the day, I know the lead has the broader vision for the project, so I'm happy to follow their direction. But I think providing a technical alternative is helpful for the team.
I appreciate that answer. It shows a good balance of technical confidence and professional humility. Well, that covers everything I wanted to go over today. Do you have any questions for us?
I do. I was wondering about the specific pipeline you use for asset handoffs. Do you use a proprietary tool for version control, or is it mostly based on a structured server system?
We actually use a hybrid system with a custom wrapper for our versioning, which I can walk you through if we move to the next stage. But for now, I think we have plenty to consider. Thank you for your time today. We will be in touch soon.
Thank you so much. I look forward to hearing from you.